Good afternoon, everybody, from a very rainy and cold and somewhat dreary Midtown Toronto. And the special greetings to Jakub Janda, our guest today. He's in, I'm pretty sure he's in Prague. He just told me it was -5 there. So that means it's a little bit warmer. And special greetings also to my colleague, Anna Petrov, whom you can also see on the screen, our very dynamic instructor of Czech language and also Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and a real activist here on the campus. We're going to jump right into it, everybody, because I can't imagine in the series that Anna and I started something that has, we do some things that are literary focused, we do something that are cultural focused, but when we were planning out our second term of conversations, front and center was to talk about Russian misinformation. And largely for the wrong reasons, it's a really pertinent topic that we're addressing that today, because that's of course front and center in our news. And our guest today, I cannot imagine a person that's better qualified to talk about this for all of us today. And we met years ago when we did a seminar, and Jakub, is that 5 years? I can't even remember. But Jakub came to, how many years was it?
I think it was 2016 or 17.
Oh my goodness. 5 years ago, but I remember this group of people we put together that were part, it was like a think tank group we put together from Central Europe. So we had Hungary, we had Budapest, we had Bratislava, we had Prague, and we had Warsaw. And the thing that came out of this was it was a short meeting, but we developed this long-term friendship. We've stayed in touch. Okay, we haven't seen each other so much, but that we'll fix shortly. But because Jakub's Center, which is European Values think tank, where he's the director, by the way, is the place to follow this nasty business. All right. And if you want to follow it, just go on their website, and I'll post it in the chat, or maybe someone can help me do that. But the European Values think tank is not just the place. I want to also thank them because it's a partnership that exists between the University of Toronto, this center, European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and European Values, because this is one of our key internship partners, where our students get an extraordinary opportunity to work there. For the past couple of years, we've been doing it online, obviously, but we're back at it, everybody, and we're going to have interns going back to Prague. And Anna, we should pick that up in our own conversations about your students, because working in that think tank now is extremely important. Now, just a couple of words about Jakub, again, director of European Values think tank. And I'm going to read this. I know his bio, but I'm going to read it to you nonetheless. Jakub Janda specializes in the response of democratic states to hostile disinformation and influence operations. He is associate fellow at the Slovak Security Policy Institute. He serves as a member of the editorial board of the expert portal AntiPropaganda.sk and as a proud member of the active reserves of the Czech Armed Forces. In 2016-2017, he was tasked by Czech security intelligence institutions to consult on, and this is in quotes, influence of foreign powers chapter with audit of national security conducted by the Czech government, where he was involved in the Czech policy shift on this issue. Since 2015, he was asked to provide briefings or trainings in more than 20 countries, including Canada, as we just mentioned. And since 2019, he serves as a member of the programming board of the Center and Kiev. In the past, he worked for the humanitarian agency ADR International and was a member, and I didn't know this, and was a member of the Czech Parliament.
No, I only worked for a member of the parliament. We have to do it.
Okay, I have to fix that, Jakub, but I'm going to leave it that you were a member of the Czech. Okay, so let me correct that, Jakub. He worked for a member of the Czech Parliament. Now, before we get started, Jakub's going to share the screen. We're going to have a PowerPoint presentation. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. And then Anna and I are here. We're going to moderate the question and answer. And I'm anticipating a very dynamic question and answer period, given the nature of the topic and the nature of the moment we live in. So Jakub, welcome to Toronto, so to speak, and greetings to Prague. I'm handing it over to you now. Thank you so much. And I'll see, by the way, I'm arriving back in Central Europe at the beginning of May, and I look forward to our paths crossing in a proper way. Thank you. I'll come back soon.
Thank you very much for having me. Do you see my screen? Is it okay?
It looks perfect.
Good. So I'll jump into it, but just a brief intro on our team as well. a bit more, to share a bit more. So currently we are an NGO sitting in Prague since 2005. Currently we have 30 people working for us, and most of our team actually focus on Russian influence and disinformation campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe. We actually started a China program as well. So currently I just spent last 4 months in Taipei in Taiwan because we just opened our branch office in Taipei to actually learn about Chinese influence operations from the Taiwanese expert community. So that's something what is out of the scope of this talk, but that's what we do as well. Because we try to serve as a hub of knowledge or policy advice as well on Russian and Chinese influence operations. That's the main focus what we have as an organization. And we are very happy to welcome new fellows and interns as well in the future. That's what we try to do ourselves. So thank you very much for that. And I will jump into it. And I think what I will do is that I will just briefly run you through some of the, I would say, basic understanding of how we see the problem of, I mean, there are different words for the same issue. Usually US government calls it malign influence. Australian government calls it foreign interference. In Central Eastern Europe, it's usually called influence operations. So basically different names for a very same thing. And what I'll try to do is that I'll run you through some of the outline, so it's maybe more better understandable of what we see sitting in Prague in Central Europe, looking over Central and Eastern Europe, mainly into the Russian activities in our region. And I'm sure we will get into the questions of the current situation around and in Ukraine as well. But I'll just start with this at the beginning. So I would argue that there are at least 7 main tools which Russia, the Russian government, we call it the Kremlin, actually which they use for influencing what happens in other countries. And here again, I'm speaking mainly about Central and Eastern Europe. So basically this is the toolkit. First, intelligence and influence operations. So basically meaning using basically Russian intelligence agencies using proxies who are usually domestic citizens of those targeted countries, who then actually spread specific information or try to influence political decisions in those European countries. We have seen this in, I would say, most of EU member states. Obviously that's something that has been very visible around the US elections in 2016 and also US elections in 2020 as well. So that has been quite visible. The second area is what we call disinformation operations. And that's, I mean, historically it has been mainly done offline, meaning in printed newspapers. That's something of like 80s and 90s. But currently, the main bulk of disinformation operations, which we see done by Russian government and its proxies, is done online, meaning on websites, through television channels, sometimes through radio, but that's quite minor usually. So disinformation operations trying to influence public opinion on specific issues. In most of our region in Central Europe, that the first focus has been on I would say after 2014, after Russia invaded Ukraine, it has been about portraying Ukraine as a failed state and trying to show that Russia is not to blame for the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously it is, but the disinformation was trying to show it is not. Then around 2015 and 16, the main topics of Russian disinformation campaigns in Europe were targeting the migration crisis, which was actually happening across Europe. And the effort was to blame mainstream, or you could say moderate political parties, center-right, center-left, so that they would get diminished or they would get crushed by mainly far-right parties. And then the fact is that many of far-right parties in Europe are very well cultivated by Russian proxies. So if you look across the European political map, many of the far-right parties are good friends of Russia, for various reasons, ideological or financial, but that's the case. And that's exactly why disinformation campaigns are such a good tool in situations like the migration crisis in Europe in 2015 and 16. So that has been the case. And currently, obviously, we could see major disinformation campaigns by Russia in and around Ukraine. That's quite visible. So third tool is what we call relevant political parties. So the effort is to cultivate individuals within the mainstream political parties who have access to government or who are sitting in the government. There the example would be the German Social Democratic Party, where we could see many, let's say, Russian proxies, like former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, former German Chancellor, who actually is a paid agent of Russian geopolitical influence. That's basically his job. That's how he's paid by Russian energy companies to actually lobby or advocate or push his current friends in the government in Germany who are members of the SPD, of the German Social Democratic Party. That's just one example. There are many others, but that's clearly what the main issue, what main focus of the Russian government is, basically buying influence into mainstream political parties. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's quite successful. Number 4, NGOs and gongos. So we have seen Russia using proxies and setting up gongos. Gongo means government orchestrated NGO, non-governmental organization. So effectively, it's like the Russian intelligence agencies setting up NGOs, which look like natural and organic, but in fact they are organized by Russian entities. And that's quite often happens, for example, with compatriot organizations. So if there is somebody trying to influence a Russian diaspora in European countries, usually it's done through NGOs, which pretend to be just natural organizations or organic civil society groups. But in fact, many of them are actually directed by Russian intelligence to gather information on the local situation, for example. That's quite visible in the Baltic countries. The fifth tool is actually, we call it support for radical and extremist groups. That's something what is very visible in Central and Eastern Europe, where some of the mainly far-right groups, but also far-right extremist groups are pretty much influenced and cultivated by Russian proxies. Some of them actually have political relevance, like AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is a far-right political party in Germany, very close Russian relations, or some of the Italian or Austrian far-right parties. That's quite visible there as well. And their Russian connections are quite well mapped and known. But also there are extremist groups quite often, let's say, being pushed by Russian entities, for example, to scout and recruit individuals from European countries who then join the Russian occupying force in Donbas in Ukraine and fight effectively on behalf of Russia against Ukraine in Donbas. There are dozens of these individuals from European countries who first started as members of extremist groups in Europe, and then they were recruited by effectively Russian intelligence entities, sent over or moved over to Donbas, to eastern Ukraine, and now they are quite often fighting on behalf of Russia against Ukraine. For example, Czech Republic has had about 10 to 15 of these individuals. Many of them are being prosecuted for terrorism or have already been prosecuted for terrorism if they come back to Czech Republic. The sixth tool I would mention is using the ethnic minority or diaspora. So it doesn't mean at all that any Russian living in Europe is actually a tool of the Russian government, not at all. But unfortunately, many of them are being coerced and they are effectively victims of Russian government's actions, quite often pressing them through their families which are still back in Russia, for example, or trying to push them to actually gather information or influence things in their own neighborhood on behalf of the Russian government. That's quite well mapped and unfortunately still quite often happening in many countries in Central Europe. And the last tool I would mention, which is very relevant, is what we call economic operations with political goals. So quite often you would have a situation where Russia tries to, let's say, have or organize a business deal that looks like only as a regular commercial business with no geopolitical reasoning behind it. That's, for example, Nord Stream 2, the pipeline from Russia to Germany, or nuclear power plants like the one in Hungary called PAX 2. So similar economic projects are pretending that they are just commercial, but at the end they have high geopolitical value, which could be used for political blackmail or influencing of individual decisions in countries like Germany with Nord Stream 2, or of the political establishment, because it allows if you have such a major economic operation or project, it actually allows you to quite often legally influence political decisions through buying political influence as a regular commercial business, well, let's say hiding or covering it as an economic business or commercial business, but with clear economic geopolitical goals. So that's unfortunately one of the tools which Russia uses pretty well. So those are the main tools. I would just move around and here we are trying to just give us a big picture of how it works in a very simplified way, obviously. At the top, you see the headquarters, the Kremlin, which is like a just a simplified way of saying this is where the decisions are taken. It's not only one physical place like the Kremlin. There are many agencies and bodies within the Russian government which make decisions. But let's say that's the Russian government's headquarters. And then they are on the left, you see the actors of influence who actually are quite often let's say supporting each other. So quite often you would see economic operation with political goals, which are interconnected to political allies of Russia. For example, the German Social Democrats connected to Nord Stream 2 in Germany, or Fidesz, the political party of Viktor Orban in Hungary, pretty much pushes forward the Pact 2 nuclear power plant deal in Hungary with Russia. So that's where, if you see the bubbles on this slide, this is actually when the bubbles overlap, that's quite often where we see how they support each other and how they are interconnected. So that's quite often very visible. And you see, if you study in detail in every country in Central Eastern Europe, you see quite often the whole influence infrastructure, which much of it is visible, much of it is not visible, and obviously we don't know, as an NGO, we don't know about all of them, but quite often they are pretty well interconnected and supporting each other. That's our current problem. So I'll move forward there as well. And this is something what we call it the Prague Manual. So if you'll be interested in that, please Google Prague Manual and European values, and you'll find a study which we did on for the Dutch government a couple of years ago. The question we got, or let's say the research question we had, was like, how can we actually, let's say, basically the question was, which steps should Western governments support in countries in Eastern neighborhood, meaning Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova, for example? Which specific steps should be supported so that we could actually push back against this strategic level Russian influence in this country? Because sometimes you could say, supporting one type of defensive activity always makes sense. So for example, if you put money and effort into media literacy programs, it always makes sense because you need to do it regardless of what is your situation. And that's true. But if you are, let's say, trying to prioritize your resources, be it as a donor government, or as a public institution like the EU or NATO or a foundation, then the question for you is what are the main tools how to push back against this problem in a particular situation? So what we did is that we have actually divided. We have looked over countries in Central Eastern Europe, and this is just a simplification of the whole study. It has about 100 pages in detail. But in the blue line, which you see in the middle, is basically where we see we put together a scale of how countries actually, how far are they in a sense of how deep is the Russian geopolitical influence in their political system. Because in some countries, there's a lot of Russian efforts, but not much of success. And there's a lot of defensive measures in that particular country. That's what we call full-scale defenders. Those are countries like Sweden or the Baltic countries, for example, which understand the problem very well on the national level and have a lot of defensive measures being put in place against the issue, against the threat. Then you have countries which we call de-awakened, meaning that they have awakened to the threat. They understand the threat is here, but they don't do that much against that. They don't deploy a full-scale strategy or fully fledged strategy against the Russian influence operations on a national level. So that's the awakened. And if you go further beyond, you see countries in denial, which are basically denying that the problem of Russian influence operations actually exists in their own country. That's what we have seen massively in Germany or France in recent years, meaning that there has been very little of defensive actions by or defensive policies of those countries put together, because the main, I would say excuse, but they would call it an argument, is saying that, well, we don't have a problem with Russian political influence in our systems, in Germany, France, Italy, or Spain, for example, which in fact there is a real problem, but the denial is quite present in much of the policy community. And then you see what we call the collaborators, meaning collaborators with Russian influence operations, and that's quite often countries which are already quite deeply penetrated by corrupted activities, such as Hungary under Viktor Orban, or in the past it might have been partly Greece and some part of their political system. So it depends on each of the countries. Cyprus is one of the great examples of a country or state which is effectively supporting Russia in some of their activities, unfortunately, such as allowing their Russian money to be washed through or to be laundered through Cyprus in massive scale. So that's basically, you can see that there are many countries which or many examples of countries where they stand, meaning how far are they potentially corrupted by Russian influence operations. So that's the blue line. And then we have, if you look through the line on the line in black words, black color, you see that there are specific actions which actually make sense in such a situation to do, to push back against that. I'll just now move to the red line, which is, let's say, the offensive activity, which means what is actually Russia doing to penetrate, to get into the political system of the targeted country. So if you look to the top left, it starts with identifying the entrance points or entry points, you could say. And that's in some countries that means individual politicians who, for ideological, financial, or even private reasons, are happy to welcome or team up with Russian geopolitical interests in that particular country. And obviously, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, or Marine Le Pen, the presidential candidate in France, are good examples, I'm afraid, who are the good entry points into their own political systems. So what happens is that after Russia actually identifies those individuals or political parties, there is an effort to, let's say, financially support them. Depends in how much it's needed and if it's needed in practice. Sometimes it's done directly, like the Russian loan for Marine Le Pen in French presidential elections. Sometimes it's done through proxies and quite invisibly. So we have seen Matteo Salvini's people from Italy asking for Russian money in recent years. We don't know in detail whether it went through or not, but we know for sure they did ask for that money. That has been publicly reported. So that's like trying to get the support for those Russian political proxies in those targeted European countries. So once there's enough of these political proxies inside of your political system, then the effort is actually obviously to expand it, to make it long-term. So there are more political parties which are supporting Russian geopolitical influence activities. So that's the focus. But the main problem for all of us is usually what we call the strategic deal. And the strategic deal is usually, with Russia, it's usually done through energy policies or projects. And quite often that means that if there is enough of Russian political proxies in that political system, in the targeted country, Russia can let's say the effort is to prepare a major project, which we call a strategic deal, in energy sector, which could actually allow Russia to fly in or to insert in much of economic means. To give you an example, Nord Stream 2 is a good example of this, a pipeline from Russia to Germany. So how exactly it works is that if you look over the timeline how this project unfolded, it actually started, let's say, first couple of German politicians pitched the idea, some Russian businessmen said it's a good idea, and later on you saw that it allowed, for legal and legitimate reasons, it looked like, it allowed Russia and Russian energy companies to actually hire many PR and lobbying agencies in Germany, which then basically did what they called commercial lobbying, well, like any other commercial project, but at the end it meant that that much of Berlin-based lobbyists, actually many of them actually did work on behalf of the Russian government because they were effectively pushing forward for Nord Stream 2, which meant that there was a lot of, I would call it, influence domination in Germany in general, in support of Nord Stream 2. So this strategy deal, it's not only about like percentage of your energy dependency on Russia in gas or nuclear power plants or on energy in general. That's only part of the problem, because those strategy deals usually take many years to do, be it 5 to 10 years for a pipeline or 15 to 20 years for a nuclear power plant. And during those times, it actually cripples, or I would say, it actually makes the domestic political situation pretty messy in your own country, because then if you invest quite a lot of political and financial capital into the project, it's hard to stop it. And this is what you could see quite simply now with the situation around Ukraine, where you see the German government actively trying to stop Nord Stream 2 to be put on the sanctions table if Russia attacks Ukraine. Because it's an important project for them, and they invested so much into it, and now the German government is effectively shielding the Russian project from a potential allied sanctions because of the Russian attack on Ukraine. So that's only an example how it can influence the foreign policy making of the domestic country. And then quite often you could move forward to what we call partial elite capture, which happens after the strategy deal is done usually, meaning that there is a lot of inflow of sometimes dirty money, or you could say corrosive capital, which allows to buy much more political influence and cultivate other political and economic proxies on behalf of Russian interests. And that's something what is quite visible in Hungary, for example, these days, where you see some parts of the Fidesz, meaning the political party of Viktor Orbán, which is pretty much interconnected on shady deals with Russian oligarchs. And that's exactly what happens. And when you allow it, you don't stop it, and then it's a one-way street because it's very hard to get out of this. So that's where the problem happens. So each of the countries in Europe is in a different part of the scale, different place of the scale, and what we are trying to do is to see which countries are where and learn from each other how to get better on the blue line. If you look into this diagram, so I'll move forward. Currently, just to give you an example, we have a lot of sociological data which shows looks over Russian disinformation impact, and specifically in the Czech Republic depends on individual narratives, but 25 to 40% of Czech population is pretty vulnerable to Russian disinformation narratives. In some cases, it really depends on individual case, and you could argue of what's the direct and indirect impact. But just to give an example, something around and this is quite a couple of years old data, so just illustrative example. Around 1/3 of Czech population actually believes that Ukraine is governed by a fascist government, like a neo-Nazi government, which might seem absurd because obviously that's not true. But if you have about 1/3 of your domestic population thinking that Ukraine is a de facto fascist state, it actually makes it very hard for example, the Czech government to openly support Ukraine and, for example, deliver weapons to Ukraine so Ukraine can better defend itself from Russia. I mean, the current government in Prague finally does it, and that's good. But just imagine how politically it is harder if you have parts of your population believing such a disinformation narratives, which means that successful disinformation campaigns not only change or influence what part of the population thinks, but it indirectly actually limits the policy options of any government, because then for the government, every democratic government needs to take into account what the population thinks, and if much of your population thinks negatively about your possible policy decision, like support for Ukraine against Russian aggression, it makes it harder for you to do it as a politician. So that's just the outcome of it. Here you could see some of the data. It's obviously 5-6 years old, so just take it as an illustrative example. for example, 38% of Czech population believed a couple of years ago that the Ukraine crisis was the fault of the United States and NATO, which, I mean, at every level that's not true. But if you have part of the population, significant part of the population believing this, it makes it very hard for making solid policy decisions later on. And as I said, 30.6% believe Ukraine government is run by fascists. So that makes it harder. So I have about 15 minutes left, so I'll go forward and see what I can manage to do. Yeah, those are just specific examples from the Czech Republic where we mentioned the political allies of the Kremlin. What are they doing? How are they doing it? Like the current Czech president, Miloš Zeman, has many Russian connections, and basically in every foreign policy aspect, he is supporting Russian geopolitical interests, unfortunately. Similarly with the far-left Communist Party and the far-right party called SPD. Similarly cultivated by Russian proxies. Many of them actually got invited to Crimea to observe the so-called elections or so-called referendums over there, which makes it easier to get cultivated. So that's actually where we are. I will actually briefly run you through what the Czech government has been doing on Russian aggression, Russian disinformation, very briefly, because I think it's interesting to see how individual governments, like the Czech one, for example, what can they actually do? And Czech Republic has not been the best responder to this Russian aggression. The best ones have been the Baltic countries, the UK partly, or Sweden. Those are clearly the best ones in Europe or in EU countries. Czech Republic is like in the B category, so not very bad, but not ideal, not in the A category. So in practice, in 2015, meaning a year after Russia invaded Ukraine, new strategic documents like foreign policy concept and security strategy has been drafted, very well describing the threat from Russia. We have seen actually quite a lot of Russian intelligence activity, which has been publicly reported by the Czech domestic counterintelligence agency called BIS. And they've been doing also public reports on some of the Russian intelligence activities, which has been very good because it actually exposed it and shown to the population what's actually happening. In 2016, quite big launch of activities like the national security audit, which I was part of as well. And the process actually looked at, let's say, until this moment, until 2016, there has been very little Czech government's action against Russian influence and disinformation campaigns. And now let me just explain why. First, the expectation or general myth, I would say, among the policy community was that we cannot do anything about disinformation because we have freedom of speech and we don't want to breach this constitutional right, which obviously is not true because there are so many things which governments can do to actually mitigate disinformation impact without interfering with freedom of speech, without limiting freedom of speech. So that was one problem. The second myth which we had to fight was that the thinking was, well, Czech Republic is in the middle of Europe. We are not physically bordering Russia, and so we are not directly threatened by Russian military action, like the Baltic countries potentially or Ukraine. So that was the second myth, that we are far away from the front line. In physical sense, yes, but in influence operations, that's not where this counts. And the third area was actually. The third myth was actually basically saying, look, the intelligence agencies are in charge of this problem, they are to deal with that. And that's something what makes sense to an extent, but the thing is that in historical terms, Central European countries, because of our history with communist era oppression, where the intelligence agencies were misused by communist parties as a totalitarian tools against their own populations, you very well know the KGB in Soviet Union or Stasi in Eastern Germany and similar agencies in Central European countries. Then in 1990s, 1990s during the democratic transition, most of intelligence agencies in Central European countries actually lost their competencies because of this historical experience. The thinking was we cannot allow such a strong culmination of power in one agency. We cannot give them this right to breach human rights. So we better disperse them basically, or diffuse them and make them pretty weak. And that's something what obviously makes sense from a democratic perspective in the 90s. But after 2014, after Russian invasion of Ukraine and their launch of aggressive activities, that's something what pretty much means that the intelligence communities in Central European countries, and many of them are very good professionals. The thing is that they don't have the capabilities and they don't have mandates to do many things which they maybe could. So most of them are not law enforcement agencies. They don't have law enforcement power, so they cannot interrogate people or arrest people, like for example the FBI can in the US. But they are more like the CSIS in Canada, which can gather information but cannot arrest people, at least to my knowledge. And that's exactly what in Central European countries, with exception of Poland, where the ABW still has this mandate. That's where we are. So that means that those three myths, including the hope that intelligence agencies will solve the problem for us, actually led to a situation that the government decided in 2016 to actually look internally and do a policy review, basically look into how big is the problem of Russian influence, how can it evolve in the next 5 years, and what should the Czech government actually start doing so that the problem doesn't grow so big so it's uncontrollable. So that was the thinking with this national security audit, and I have been part of it as an external consultant. So if you want to look into it, the non-classified version is actually public in English as well. So if you Google National Security Audit Czech Republic 2016, you'll find a document of about 100 pages in English on Czech government's website, which actually explains there's a SWOT analysis, there are specific steps to be taken. So much of it can be very well read and understood. And the outcome of this was actually change of some of government's practices, new policies. Some of it is still classified, so we cannot really discuss it in detail. But the general decisions, the general changes in the Czech government's policy are public, and they are well known there in the national security audit. So that's something what could very well be studied, and I think it's relatively unique for a European situation. So that's and that has been 2016 and 17 where we work on that. So that was just a start. I will just maybe finish up by saying that in 2017 the Czech government actually launched new government bodies. So within the Ministry of Interior, we have a new Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats, which is effectively a team of people looking into hybrid threats, effectively Russian and Chinese influence operations, which actually means that it sits at the Ministry of Interior, our version of the US Home Office, for example, UK Home Office or DHS in the US. And that's I think smart, because in some cases in countries like Czech Republic, where we don't feel the physical threat of military invasion like the Baltic countries do, then the main response is led by defense ministries in Baltic countries or in Ukraine. But in our situation in Czech Republic, where we are physically more distant from the NATO border with Russia, our main problem is, let's say, domestic security or homeland security, you could say. And it's quite similar to how Australia has actually responded to Chinese influence operations, where in the Ministry of Interior, the Home Office, I think, Home Affairs Ministry in Australia, there's a national coordinator against foreign interference with a very similar role like this Czech government center has within the Czech Ministry of Interior. So there has been also a lot of work to protect Czech elections from foreign interference. I can discuss it later on as well, but I'm just thinking maybe I'll stop here and we have enough time for questions and answers, something was more relevant to you. So I maybe will stop now and give the floor back and see what the questions are.
Jakub, I just sent you a note in the chat saying, don't feel you have to rush, but we can we can go to, if you're comfortable, do you want to go to Q&A? Because I didn't want you to miss any slides, right? And Anna's there too. Like we've still, it's up to you. What do you think, Anna?
I would maybe suggest to go to two questions because they might be also relevant to current situation around Ukraine. I mean, I have dozens of other slides to show, but I think it's better if people ask what's relevant to them.
Okay. So I've got to get to the chat box here and see, because I've got a couple of questions. And I've got a bunch of students there too. So I'm just going to, give me a second, Jakub, just to get organized.
Sure.
Anna, you're going to hang around for a few more minutes, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Anna, why don't you get us started while I sort out things in the Q&A, okay, Anna?
Okay, yes, great.
You were going to write me a question, right, Anna? But
yeah, I wanted to write it, but then we stopped, so I can actually ask the question that I think might be interesting also to hear something about. I will make a short introduction. I'm going to research about the Russian and Chinese media that are having the influence on the Serbian and Croatian international broadcasters that are having their medias in Serbia and Croatia. And I'm planning during this summer to do the similar research with the Czech medias. And now when I was preparing to do that, I didn't find a lot about it. So I just wanted to ask you, in this era when media is having also a huge influence on everything, on a nation, on a government, on everything, what is the situation with the Russian media and its influence to Czech people, government, nation, country, everything? Can you tell something about that? Is there any Russian broadcaster or something that is financed by Russia and that is actually the newspapers, the website, the TV channel, anything that is influenced by the Russian financed, let's say Russian financed media? Yeah. So can you tell us briefly something about that, or at least me?
Yes.
Thank you.
So specifically in the Czech context, and that's very similar to most of countries in Central Europe, since there are not many Russian language speakers. I mean, generally the older population speaks Russian, but they don't receive the daily information in Russian. But in countries where there are no large Russian diasporas, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, or Poland or Hungary, there I would say the main disinformation actually happens in national languages, like Czech language in Czech Republic. So it's basically laundered through disinformation websites through specific media channels, which actually specialize in, I would say, laundering disinformation from quite often Russian language channels or English language channels from Russia, like RT, with like formerly Russia Today and similar channels, or Sputnik. So they actually basically translate or launder the same messaging into the national languages. So it doesn't look like purely Russian government propaganda, but it looks like domestic protest movement or something like that. That's quite often what happens in general. Basically, Russia has two main tools in English or national languages. One is RT, the TV station, which broadcasts in many languages, not only in English, also in Spanish and many other languages. And it's a huge enterprise, which is very well used for spreading Russian government's messaging. I wouldn't call it journalism at all. It's a communication channels of the Russian government, and there are so many studies showing it. So that's one. Second is Sputnik, which is like Russian state. It's actually not a news agency. That's TASS, but Sputnik is more like again like a communication channel of the Russian government, where they communicate whatever they are told, and there are actually weekly meetings in the Russian government which are giving them talking points to focus on every week. Something what you wouldn't expect journalists to do in a democratic country, like get talking points from the government officials. But that's obviously what happens in Russia. So those are quite usual suspects. Then they are let's say Russian language channels, sometimes direct, sometimes media, sometimes like Telegram channels, for example, like social media channels, which are targeting specific parts of the diasporas of Russian speaking diasporas, like in the Baltic countries, for example. And they are trying to actually, I would say, create a closed bubble of information influence into those individuals. So, for example, in the Baltic countries, one of the key part of the messaging is that if there is a war between Russia and NATO and the Baltic over the Baltic countries, that those Russian speakers living in the Baltic countries, they should not actually take up arms and defend their own country like Latvia or Lithuania against the Russian aggression, because they wouldn't like to fight their own brothers from Russia, for example. And that might seem absurd in a way, but if you look through numbers, through sociological research, which actually shows every year what's the amount of support for similar narratives among some parts of the Russian diasporas in the Baltic countries, it's actually a real problem. In a military defense sense. So that's something what is clearly the attempt, and how does it operate? I'm not sure I really answered all parts of your question, I hope. So
thank you. Yes, it was. Yes, thank you. It was mainly about the Czech language media. Yes. For example, Sputnik. I guess that it is similar to Serbian Sputnik. So I will do the research, I hope, in summertime, so we can keep in touch, and I will ask if I need some of your help. Thank you so much.
And we have quite a lot of. Sorry, we have.
Sorry, I've interrupted here. Go on, Jakub.
Sorry, just to follow up, we have quite a lot of reports or studies which actually show what we call the disinformation ecosystem in the Czech Republic. Some of it is in Czech, some of it is in English as well. We have a team which follows Russian disinformation in the Czech language as well. So happy to share it with you. Most of it is public.
Thank you so much. We will keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So Jakub, I've got a lot of questions, and I've got many questions from some Czech compatriots and some big supporters and friends of our center. So I'm going to go through them now. And Georgina was one of the people who wanted to say hi to you at the beginning. How would one differentiate between the 7 tools of influence you cite as used by democracies like the US and the way China and Russia use them?
Okay. Yes.
And by the way, there's another question coming up that's the $1 million question. So stay tuned.
Well, the difference is, I mean, in some of the cases, it's usually the transparency. So because the usual question you would get is like, how is Radio Free Europe different from RT, for example? That's the usual question. And then, so you could see sometimes it's the transparency, meaning whether it's visible who is funding what, and that's sometimes not fully transparent on the Russian side. And second, if you look whether they follow journalistic standards, and there you don't have to trust me or any researcher, but you could look, for example, the British state regulator for media. I forgot its name, but they actually gave several sanctions to RT in the UK because they breached so many rules of journalistic standards on such a very basic level. It was so absurd that that's something what usually is the main difference. So that's one. Also, you could see the usual example is that if you have democratic media from any government, usually when they make a mistake, and they always make mistakes as any humans, they usually correct them. And that's something what usually does not happen with Russian state-owned TV channels, because they don't have a reason to correct their own disinformation quite often. So that's sometimes what is quite visible. But I'm just now speaking about a small portion of it, which is the media channels. But they're quite often, if you look over, for example, the far right or extremist groups, well, we have so much evidence of Russia supporting financially or intelligence-wise the extremist groups in Europe, for example, but we don't see Europeans supporting Russian nationalists nationalists, I mean, or extremist group inside of Russia, for example. So that's usually you have to look at the evidence, meaning what's confirmed and what's visible, because that's where the usual differences are. The other difference is that we call it transparency of spending, because quite often democratic governments have to be accountable to their own parliaments or populations over how are they spending taxpayers' money. And quite often that's something where what you don't see with obviously Russian or Chinese government, because they can decide on their own how much they're going to spend on defense or influence activities, and they don't have to be accountable basically to anybody, because their parliaments are effectively fake, or they are not real parliaments in Russia or China. So that's the difference, which is maybe more procedural, so maybe not so interesting, but usually that's quite visible. I'm actually thinking whether we have seen other examples, but maybe I will stop here for a second. Okay.
Thanks, Jakub, and thanks, Georgina, for the question, and greetings, special greetings to you. I'm jumping around on these questions now because I'm looking at different ones. I'm going to George Hanush now, and you can probably see it, but and George is also a dear friend and a friend of the center as well. Do you have any idea what Putin is trying to do with his military buildup near Ukraine? Is this energy politics? Is this trying to influence the Russian populations in the Central European countries, defines of borders? Is he trying to influence the EU and NATO from enlarging? You know, that's the million-dollar question, and good luck with that one.
Yes, so effectively the main goal for Putin, for the Russian government, is to first stop Ukraine not from becoming member of NATO, because that's not happening anytime soon, but effectively to make Ukraine into a failed state. That's exactly what Russia wants, because a successful, rich and free Ukraine would be a direct threat to the regime inside Russia, because many Russians would actually see that Ukraine is doing quite well, and that the rule by democratic rule of law is much better than the dictatorship which is actually happening in Russia. So that's clearly what actually Putin is trying to do, and the main question is how. So how can you actually destabilize countries in Eastern Europe? Is one, you could invade them and effectively annex part of them. That's what happens in Moldova, in Georgia, in Ukraine as well. You can basically station Russian troops on their territory, which first makes a lot of domestic problems for those countries, political, social, or economic problems, and it effectively stops any possible integration into EU and NATO in the future if somebody is occupying you. Because effectively, to apply for EU or NATO membership, you need to have good relationships with your neighbors. That's basically the rule, and it's quite hard if you have Russia as your neighbor, right? So that's something what Russia can and is doing to stop countries not really from joining EU and NATO, because that's a long process which is not on the table now, but in the process of getting there or moving towards the future membership. That's exactly how Russia can do it, and so that's the long-term plan. How are they actually doing it? But then the second question is actually the let's say, how are they doing it in practical sense, in current situation. And here I'm afraid the build-up is actually serving two purposes. One, when Russia actually effectively prepares for real military attack against Ukraine on a massive scale, as basically the military escalation leads to diplomatic escalation, where Russia hopes that some of European countries will effectively come running to Russia and say, okay, we don't want war, so we better give up on Ukraine in a sense of EU and NATO memberships. Here we are promising it to you, please pull your forces back. I'm sorry. That's exactly what they want. That's exactly what Russia wants, and we'll see if it happens, because that's clearly what would be a big betrayal of Ukraine effort to be independent. So that's clearly what seems to be the goal there. Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks, George, for that question. I'm going to read. It's a long question, but it's a good question. It's actually, Jakub, it's from that student we spoke about just before we got into our session. So this is also very timely. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm particularly interested in your point about influence campaigns that impact Russian-speaking diasporic populations. I know most of your work has focused on European countries, but to what extent do you think the Russian diaspora in North America has been influenced, especially since the US and Canada have a pretty significant population of Russian speakers? Based on my research on the media consumption habits of Russian speakers in Toronto, I know many people who've immigrated from the FSU continue to read and consume Russian state-sponsored media, but there's also an entire community online of Russian commentators, like, I don't know any of these people, Jakub, only 10 vaguely, like Maxim Katz, Yuri Tabak, Mikhail Veller, etc. What do you think their role is in influencing the Russian-speaking diaspora? Good question.
Yep, it's a very good question. Admittedly, I'm not an expert on this particular issue myself. I have to rely on research and knowledge of others, like the Free Russia Foundation, who are good partners of us and have done very good studies on looking into the Russian influence activities inside of the US and the diasporas as well. So, I mean, one of the key problems is, for example, the Russian oligarchs money laundering in the US. That's something what has been very well mapped by a good colleague. His name is Ilya Zaslavsky. He worked with Free Russia Foundation. Ilya Zaslavsky is his name, and he did a very good research which actually maps how Russian oligarchs are effectively buying political influence in, for example, sometimes it's through political foundations in the US, sometimes through university boards in some of the US universities. So that's something what I think is worrying and is bad to see that is happening. Sometimes it's harder to actually use legal means to stop it because I mean, what is good is, I mean, the US has the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which actually forces foreign entities when they try to lobby somebody in the US to actually acknowledge it, who they are lobbying on whose behalf. So that's something what is good. That's something what Europeans don't have. We don't have this kind of transparency scheme for lobbyists. That's what Australia just put together a couple of years ago, and the US have it since the late 30s. So that's something what is a good tool to expose, or I would say enforce, transparency in lobbying. But then the problem is that much of the it only looks at a narrow part of the influence game because there are ways how you could get around that. So, for example, if you don't want to lobby or influence the US Congress or the US government, you don't claim that you are doing it, you could actually get around the FARA registration and pretend that you are just a philanthropic oligarch which is just supporting an individual college or individual political foundation. But in fact, you could do much more than that. So I'm not an expert, honestly, on that issue. I cannot really comment on the names. I would love to, but I'm not an expert. But I think Ilya Zaslavsky and a couple of other colleagues from Free Russia Foundation, like Natalia Arno, they have published a good research on that, actually.
Thanks, and thanks, Rudy, for the question. I've got another student here, and he's based in. Oh, just quickly before I forget. Some of you are putting up your hands. You have to put the question in the Q&A box, the hand up. So you have to type it out. Just that's the only way I can see it. The hand up, because there's no other way for me to interact with the audience. This student, again, pretty sure he's in Trenčín. And remember, I used to live in Banska Bystrica, and I still look back fondly on those days. And I hope someday I'll live there again. But who knows? So this is from Tomáš Iliev, and a future student here, in fact. Dear Mr. Janda, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. My question is it even possible for BIS and Czech counterintelligence to effectively challenge, in brackets, counter, the Russian activities in Czechia? Would it not be more appropriate to increase the financing of these institutions? Moreover, in my opinion, it would be fair to upgrade the whole strategic concept. This is really front and center for you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I mean, the question of funding is not a major problem. The BIS and the other two intelligence agencies got their budgets increased in recent years, and they say that it's good enough, which is quite rare for a government agency to say they have enough money for that. You know, every government agency says they don't have enough. So that to me says that that's not a major problem there with the funding. But the problem we have is that sometimes we have pretty outdated legislation, which means that, as you know, every government agency can only act legally, can do something if it has a legal mandate to do it, which means that sometimes when you have outdated laws, it limits what you can do. So two examples I would give, and that's where hopefully this new government, and we are trying to push them to do it, will change those two legislative pieces, so it will become easier to push out against Russian geopolitical influence in Czech Republic. One is we have effectively an espionage act which has been set up in the 60s, and just to give an example, if I was a Russian intelligence operative and I would take you, let's say, Robert, if you would be like a Czech senator, member of the Czech Senate, if I would come to you in Prague and say, hey, Robert, look, I'm a guy from SVR, from Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, and I would like you to come over with me to the Russian embassy in Prague, and let's talk about what you guys are doing in the parliament this week, and how is the Czech government thinking on whatever, Ukraine. And I would take you to the Russian embassy in Prague, and you would go there, and you would discuss anything what you know. It would be legal, and it's hard to stop it, because if you don't share classified information, it is all safe. meaning that you are doing a legal activity, and we cannot prosecute you for that. That means that if you look over legislation in most of European countries on espionage, most of the espionage, how it's defined in legislation in European countries, it means that it's stealing classified information, so formally classified documents. And the problem is that what Russian intelligence agencies want, what their desire, what they're trying to get, is not only classified information, but many more details around it, like who is deciding on what activities, what's the current thinking inside the government of specific activities there as well. Because let's say, and this might be more procedural, but because the way how our governments work in at least Central European countries where I know it quite well, the effort is, because the classification of information is quite a bureaucratic process, many things which I believe should be classified are not classified. So because it's just so hard to do it, actually, not hard, but it takes so much time and effort. So quite often they just skip it and they just discuss things without putting it on paper as well. So basically what I'm trying to say is that there's a loophole in our legislation for quite a long time, and that makes it easier to actually steal it without any problems. So updating the Espionage Act is exactly what I hope will happen soon. Some countries, like in the Baltic states, have changed their definition of espionage into something like effectively working systematically and knowingly on behalf of a foreign intelligence agency, which is different from stealing classified information, because you can work for Russian intelligence, know it, do it systematically, get money for it, and not do, technically speaking, not do espionage because you don't steal classified information. So that's the gap, that's the problem, and that's where we could actually hopefully change that part of legislation. So that's one problem, one potential loophole, or one big loophole. The second one is actually on what we call money laundering. So again, just an example. If you come to Czech Republic or into Czech Republic, and you bring a ton of cash in suitcase, for example, you bring millions of US dollars, and if you put it into your bank account or buy a real estate here, and then obviously the financial intelligence unit of the police will actually find it out, or bank will report on you and say, look, there is something suspicious, the guy is coming over with a ton of cash and we have no idea what happened. So what happens is that then your transactions will be frozen temporarily until you are investigated. And during the investigation, you will actually be asked, the Czech police would have to actually prove that your money comes from a crime, and a very specific crime. Which means that it's sometimes very hard to do it, because imagine if you are a Russian oligarch or an oligarch from Azerbaijan, for example, and you come to the Czech Republic with tons of cash because you effectively stole it from the citizens of Russia or Azerbaijan because you are part of the governing elite, for example. So what happens technically is that you buy a real estate in Czech Republic, Czech police blocks it because they clearly see that's a dirty thing you are doing, and they will ask you, so can you prove that your money is coming from clean sources? You have obtained it legally, and you will say, yes, of course, just ask the country I come from. So what Czech police will do is that they will send what is called an international legal assistance. Effectively, they'll send a file to Russia or Azerbaijan and say, look, we have this guy in Czech Republic buying real estate like crazy, and he has this kind of cash. Can you tell us if that cash is stolen? Are you investigating the guy for some crime he did? And the Russian police or Azerbaijani police will say, no, we have no information on the guy. And then you are screwed, because you cannot prosecute it, because current Czech legislation, and that's the case in most of countries in Europe, actually allows you to stop it, to actually prosecute it only if you can prove that the money was obtained legally. That's different. And then again, just to give you a good example where it can work quite fine in the UK, is that they have something called unexplained wealth order. That's a legal tool, and what it means is that if you are, let's say, a Russian oligarch in London buying something big for clearly dirty money, and then the British police will come to you and say, okay, so can you prove that your money was obtained legally? And it's your job to actually prove it, not the police job to prove it's illegal, but you as an oligarch to show it is obtained legally. And if you cannot do it, they can actually tax you to 100% and effectively take it away from you. I mean, the UK police doesn't use it that much. I mean, they should do it much more, and there's good research showing how much it is not used, but the tool actually exists and it can be used in this sense. So sorry for going long, but those are maybe technical details, but those are things which actually does have the impact, because you can have as many policemen or counterintelligence officers as you want, but if you don't have the legal tools to do it in a democracy, you cannot do anything. So that's the problem there.
Yeah, I'm glad, Jakub, that you, because I was going to follow up with what was the difference between the Czech state of affairs and the UK, because even, you know, routinely in the Financial Times, the British government is being hammered in this relationship with Russia. We have Germany with Nord Stream 2, but we have the United Kingdom, which is, you know, and this is a quote from the FT, which is that London is a money laundering center for dirty Russian money. But as you point out, they at least have the tools. They're just not using them. I don't know, to be frank, what the situation is in Canada regarding that. So that's something maybe we can follow up on. I've got, sorry, you go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know the Canadian example, but in the UK, London is quite often nicknamed Londongrad, like a Russian proverb, because there is a lot of Russian dirty money by Russian oligarchs buying property or football clubs or many other things in there, and it has been a long-term problem. There has been even Russian funding for the Conservative Party, which is quite proven, unfortunately. So those things are real and a real problem. And now, maybe just because of the domestic problems of the Prime Minister in the UK, he is finally doing steps against that. So, I mean, for a long time, the UK has been doing many good, I would say, many principled decisions on Russia, but outside of the UK. So the UK has been a good ally in the Baltic countries or generally in continental Europe, but inside of the UK government actually allowed a lot of Russian dirty money to influence their own politics and effectively buy influence in London. So that's a real problem, but it's slowly changing to stop. But it is clearly a long-term problem. And there is great research by Chatham House, for example.
Yes.
A lot of in-depth knowledge on that.
Yeah. Okay. Before I've got a couple of good questions from a gentleman named Miroslav Hruška, but I just want to ask you, because I know in the past you've clashed with the president of the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Can you just take us into a little bit more of a deep dive about our assumptions about him as a vehicle for Russian influence in Czechia?
Yes. So our dear president, and I think it's good to understand the Czech constitutional system, is that the Czech president is the formal head of state, but he doesn't have much of executive powers, meaning that the executive branch is effectively led by the government and the prime minister, which is honestly good for us. So we are a parliamentary democracy, meaning that the president is elected, but the president has limited competencies in our constitutional system. The Czech president has similar level of competencies like the German or Slovak or Hungarian president, who basically are more ceremonial figures. But still, the president can have a lot of negative influence because, for example, the Czech president appoints Czech ambassadors, which means that he can effectively blackmail the Czech foreign minister over decisions on foreign policy posts like the ambassadors, for example. And similar other issues. So that's just the context. So that you, when you speak about the Czech president, it's not like the commander-in-chief in a sense of the United States, for example. So that's different. But in practice, in the Czech president, well, he was elected first in 2013. First, it wasn't he is a former prime minister and a former head of the Social Democratic Party, a center left. I mean, quite known for his corruption scandals from early 2000s, but until 2013, he hasn't been seen as a pro-Russian actor that much. But what happened was that actually his closest advisors have been directly paid by Russian energy companies, one called Lukoil, for example. And that's already proven. That's public knowledge. And obviously you could say, okay, so that's just advisors. That doesn't mean much. But Then you look over the actions of the Czech president, and since summer 2014, and remember in spring 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. In summer 2014, the Czech president actually started to, I would say, act on behalf of Russian geopolitical interests. So, for example, he was publicly claiming that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. He was claiming that that Ukraine doesn't have a right to decide on its own foreign policy, and that kind of basically Russian messaging from inside of EU and NATO member state, which has been pretty horrible. And he has been saying that Ukraine is effectively a failed state. He's been pumping up the alleged far-right trends in or movements in Ukraine. So basically copy-pasting the Russian government messaging. So that has been publicly known. The other thing which has been publicly known is that the Czech president has been openly attacking the Czech law enforcement and counterintelligence community, the agencies, the directors of these agencies, be it on Russia-related issues with the domestic counterintelligence agency called BIS, or on China-related issues to the Czech cyber agency since 2018. So that has been his actions of, I would say, political sabotage inside of the Czech political system, which sometimes have been quite successful. Sometimes he failed to let's say change the policy, but it has been very disruptive in this case. He's been a good communicator of Russian messaging inside of Czech Republic and internationally as well. Because, for example, after the Skripal case, after Russia effectively targeted a British national in Salisbury in the UK, Sergei Skripal and his daughter, the Czech president actually claimed publicly that maybe the poison was actually developed in the Czech Republic, not in Russia, which obviously is not true. It has been denied or debunked. But this is exactly what Russia needed during that situation, to have another European leader standing up and saying, maybe we were involved. It wasn't just Russia. It sounds crazy, but that's exactly what happened, unfortunately. So the reasons for it, there might be various reasons. Usually in this area, there's like a simplified methodology within the intelligence community, which is called MICE. Money stands for M stands for money. A stands for ideology. C stands for compromat, like compromising, blackmailing somebody. E stands for ego, like personal issues. And those are usually the four reasons why, and usually they are mixed, not only one is sufficient, why people actually betray their own countries, why they get recruited by foreign intelligence agencies. Usually those are, let's say, the four vulnerabilities of every human, and it only depends on how vulnerable you are and how successful the attacker, the recruiting agency is. Whether you are susceptible to personal blackmail because you did something wrong and they could go over that. And that's something what can actually happen, or there is the money influence as well. Many people are easily to be bought for financial reasons. So it depends. I cannot really. I don't have non-public knowledge on our president. I clearly see what he does publicly, and it's pretty horrible. So we call him out as much as possible as well. Fortunately, he's finishing his term and he's ending his term next March. So he has only about 12 months left in his second mandate, and his health is not good, so he's not very active at this moment, which I think is good for all of us, because now with the situation around Ukraine, he is not actually so active at this moment. But unfortunately, Czech Republic has a president who is serving Russia for last 7 years, you could say, yeah.
Okay, so again, I'm going to cover the Miroslav's question, but I have to take advantage of you being here. If we shift from a guy like Zeman to the Prime Minister of Hungary, can you kind of take a big picture approach? Prior to the resignation of Chancellor Merkel, the European politician who met the president of Russia the most was, of course, Viktor Orban. And moreover, Orban is now the longest serving leader in the European Union in power, of course, since 2010. If I do hazard a prediction here, Jakub, I do believe that his party can win quite easily the 2022 elections that are coming up in April. Mm-hmm. So having said that, I also study Hungary quite closely, and I get the feeling that the government's policy towards Hungary, and I'm talking the Hungarian government, is known by only one person. And that isn't the foreign minister, Szijjártó. It's actually the prime minister. What's the game here? What's the long game that Hungary is playing here.
Yeah, and it's honestly pretty scary for all of us here in Central Europe, because it's not only about Russia, where the Hungarian government under Viktor Orban is effectively positioning itself as the best friend of Russia in our region, right. But also the Hungarian government is actually supporting Russian geopolitical activities partly in Central Europe. So, for example, by attacking Ukraine on many levels. Just recently, for example, the Hungarian government blocked a membership of Ukraine in a NATO cyber security center, just because they want to cripple Ukraine in any sense. That's public knowledge as well. Happened just a couple of weeks ago. So constant attacks by Hungarian government on Ukraine, or for example, Hungarian government support for nationalists in the Balkans, which is very, very worrying. So Mr. Milorad Dodik, who is actually one of, he's now sanctioned by the US, and he's effectively trying to destabilize Bosnia, which is pretty horrifying situation. And Viktor Orban is openly supporting him, which is again unthinkable for us, given that we all want stable Balkan countries. And Viktor Orban is supporting them there as well. We just published a quite lengthy report which outlines all these actions which the Hungarian government does in support of Russia or China in our region. So unfortunately it's quite a lot of things what they do. But your question, Robert, was about what's the end goal? Why
what's happening big picture here?
Yes. I mean, that's something what obviously you cannot really research in detail, in a sense that you could have evidence to it. But if you combine what's the Hungarian government doing now, what are they promoting, in a sense, what are they thinking to do in the future when they talk about their plans? The fear is, and that's what Viktor Orban is saying domestically in Hungary, in Hungarian language, so not everybody can read it, not from the West. So it's quite domestic rhetorics. Basically, he's saying, look, the Western European countries have failed us as Hungarians. Western European countries failed to, he calls it, solve the Hungarian issue, and Hungarian issue means Hungary is not happy about its current borders. And that might sound like crap from the 19th century, but unfortunately, that's a deeply rooted ideological position of Viktor Orban and his colleagues. So that's why when you look in detail what the Hungarian government is doing, they are, for example, buying political influence through political parties, NGOs, or ethnic groups in neighboring countries, in Slovakia, in Ukraine, or Romania, or even Croatia as well, where they are trying to build basically ecosystem of, let's say, pro-Orban, not pro-Orban political parties and the political influence tools, which actually vote for Orban in Hungarian national elections. So it's a tool to get political votes. That's something what is quite understandable, even though it's the tools for it are quite illegitimate, but you could imagine what it means. But overall, the big game, I would argue, is that Hungary basically wants to expand its regional influence in spite or despite the interest of all of its neighbors. And here is specifically Slovakia, Ukraine, and Romania. And honestly, governments in Slovakia, in Ukraine, and in Romania are very scared of it. They don't speak about it publicly because it's too sensitive to open like a cross-border dispute. But just recently, in southern Slovakia, there were many cases where actually Hungarian government actually bought political influence. So there is police investigations into that. But also the Hungarian government actually created a fund to buy land in Slovakia, which is something what usually neighboring countries don't do. Obviously, individual commercial groups do it, but just imagine that your neighboring country would be buying your own land in your country. That's something what we haven't seen for decades, I'm sure. So it created a lot of political backlash by the Slovak government, so it was stopped for a while, but those things actually keep happening. So I'm afraid the revisionist policy plan is clearly exactly what Viktor Orban wants. And in his political calculation, he actually bets on first Russia giving him the political power in the region in the future, because he thinks that effectively Central Europe will to some extent become a part of the Russian sphere of influence. That's something what he says domestically as well. And second, he bet on the Chinese money. That's why you see the Hungarian government doing many things to support or to invite Chinese influence into Hungary. Again, something which is very worrying for other regional countries, but that's what he does. So that's what is pretty worrying for all of us in this region now.
Yeah, very complicated, but very good answer. And we'll talk more when we get up. I have a lot more about COVID to talk to you about in Central Europe, but I got a couple more questions. And don't forget, we have that question that one of my undergrads sent by email. But let me go to Miroslav Hruška, just because it's a very specific question. I've recently seen on a magazine bookshelf a Hungarian government publication called The Hungarian Conservative, a journal with high publication values and a content with right/extreme right leanings. Have you heard of this, and what are your comments on this?
Yeah, I don't know the specific journal, but I could imagine what it is because we have seen Hungarian government actually portraying itself as the leader of the conservative movement in Europe. And that's something what they try to put in contrast with what they call crazy Western European liberals or leftists, how they call it. And the Hungarian government tries to position itself as the supporter or defender of traditional conservative values, from like family, anti-abortion, like kind of very conservative. I would say the conservative part of very conservative part of the U.S. Republican Party, for example. That's where Viktor Orban tries to position himself ideologically. In his case, it's also serving Russia, which is not conservative at all. That's what Hungary does. That's why you see Viktor Orban trying to, let's say, have good political connections to some of the U.S. Republicans, President Trump, former President Trump, and Mike Pence as well, and a couple of other U.S. conservatives. And that's where Orban tries to put together a new European Parliament group, which effectively means putting together people like Matteo Salvini from Italy, PiS, the political party governing in Poland now, or Marine Le Pen, the far-right party from France. So Viktor Orban tries to position himself as the, let's say, ultra-conservative leader, which is for him a way how to domestically solidify the support and picture all of his domestic political opposition as the crazy leftist liberals who are supporting by George Soros, EU, the US as well. So that's his positioning domestically, but also internationally. So he's basically he's trying to look like small Russia in an ideological sense, like we are defenders of the traditional values, blah blah blah, which obviously is not true if you look over direct policies and the examples. But this is the messaging which the Hungarian government tries to do. Because they see it as the only option how they could look legitimate in the international arena, while in effect they are effectively puppets of Russian and Chinese interest in Central Europe. But this is a way how to frame it, that they are seen as legitimate, maybe a bit off on the center right or far right, but that's how they try to position themselves, even though the high level of corruption in the Hungarian government is well known in that.
Jakub, I'm gonna squeeze in one more question, okay?
Sure.
And we'll pack it in. It's 8 o'clock over there for you. I don't know if you've had your dinner yet.
That's fine.
Now, this is from an undergrad, and I got this message because this student couldn't attend today, and she was very interested. She's of Ukrainian background. She's, the thing with the Ukrainian crisis, and I work with Ukrainians here, by the way. I have two of my colleagues are Ukrainian who are sitting, beside me. This crisis isn't new because this is hanging over Ukraine for a long time. It may be a little bit hotter now. But to say that this is a new crisis doesn't capture how long this Russian threat has loomed over Ukraine, in the same way that Russia, provoked Georgia so much up until 2008 that the fact that Georgia attacked first, didn't strike me as odd, given the amount of provocations made by the Russian Federation. But the student's question it speaks to a larger issue. She writes, I was wondering if I could have one of my questions answered by him. I wanted to ask about the best way that we as normal citizens can combat Russian disinformation, especially on social media, as I've been trying to do for the past few months with varying levels of success. This is also a big picture question, but it's an important question whether you're in Canada and, as you said, lots of other places. I think that's a good way to end the discussion today.
Yep. I think as an individual, you can volunteer with NGOs who are actually already doing it. Those are sometimes fact-checking organizations like Stop Fake in Ukraine and many others, or NGOs which work on media literacy programs, so who go to primary or secondary schools and try to explain how to analyze, how to understand media information, for example. So that's one option. The other option is that you could actually, when you are online, you could actually look at basically try to persuade your own neighbors, friends in your social bubble, because quite often you will always find somebody who is susceptible to some part of Russian or other extremist messaging. But then it's important to think about how you do it. There are good guidelines or manuals how you could actually persuade people from, let's say, so they stop believing some of the myth or disinformation, because usually it hits into their ideological spectrum, so people believe it more, as we see around COVID disinformation or other topics, not only geopolitical. So I mean, it's the easy answer is find an NGO where you could volunteer with, for example, or that's usually in an organized way what actually makes sense to do, I think, because it's honestly, the fight is so big. I'm speaking about disinformation in general, that let's say if you do it only as one individual without any network or support of other people doing similar things, you will feel alone, quite often frustrated, and quite often emotionally drained, I would say. That's what happens to many of my colleagues in this region as well, because it's a long-term problem and it's easy to get frustrated by it. So I think it's good to do it with a group of people who you like or with who you agree with, so that you don't feel alone when you engage in this activity.
Terrific. I think on that note, Jakub, we're going to let you get on with your, I don't know what you're up to tonight, but I hope it's something interesting, and let's stay in touch like we always do, even though we haven't seen each other so much. The only thing I can say is I think today's conversation was first rate, and your expertise is really incredible. So let's agree that we bring that nice, there's four of us. There was Petr Greco, there was Jacek Kucharczyk, Milan Nič.
Yes,
and you. We should I pledge right now that we'll have the four of you back here, because I stay in touch. Milan is in Berlin right now. He's a terrific observer. Jacek, we stay in touch too. He joined your organization hosting an intern. And Peter is also like one of our best partners in Central Europe. Perfect. So I want to thank the audience for their enthusiasm. Jakub, we got some paperwork. I'll deal with it tomorrow if you don't mind. Please, but let's stay in touch, especially on internship and other matters. So I'm clapping here, but I have to learn I can use this. I don't know where those things are. Emotion, whatever. I've only got raised hand, but it was a terrific talk, and a special thanks to the wonderful audience and the great questions from everybody. And enjoy your evening in Prague, and we're waiting for freezing rain and a big snowstorm here.
Enjoy. Thank you, Robert.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I just sit here and make